In the summer of 1995, the city of Thunder Bay, Ontario, carried the steady rhythm of a northern community. Ships docking along Lake Superior, families walking along the waterfront, and students filling classrooms at Lakehead University. It was the kind of city where people still nodded to strangers on the street, where news traveled quickly through neighborhoods. But on June 23rd of that year, the name Tammy Leakey began to circulate in whispers, headlines, and frantic pleas. Tammy was 15 years old, a bright and independent teenager known for her outgoing personality. She had dreams that stretched beyond Thunder Bay, ambitions that spoke of a future she was eager to chase. That June evening, she was last seen walking near her home. It was supposed to be just another summer night in her neighborhood, the kind where kids roamed freely and returned before dark. But Tammy never came back. By morning, her disappearance had escalated into a citywide search. Her family reported her missing almost immediately, knowing this was out of character. Police responded quickly, canvassing the area and speaking with neighbors. Flyers went up across Thunder Bay, Tammy's photograph staring out from telephone poles and storefronts. Volunteers joined the search, combing wooded trails and checking abandoned lots. For a time, the community clung to hope that she might still be alive. But 3 days later, hope was extinguished. Tammy's body was discovered in a wooded area on the edge of town. She had been brutally assaulted and murdered. The news sent shockwaves through Thunder Bay. Parents pulled their children closer, curfews tightened, and the sense of safety that had defined the community crumbled overnight. The investigation began with urgency. Police gathered evidence from the scene, collected statements from those who had last seen Tammy, and worked to establish a timeline of her final hours. But leads quickly began to dry up. Witnesses reported seeing Tammy walking alone, but no one seemed to know who she might have met or where she might have been headed. As days turned into weeks, frustration grew. The brutality of the crime suggested someone with dangerous impulses, someone who might strike again. But no arrest came. Suspects were questioned and released. Tips poured in, but none provided the breakthrough detectives needed. The case grew colder with each passing year, despite the determination of investigators who refused to let Tammy's file fade into the background. For Tammy's family, the pain was immeasurable. They had lost not only a daughter, but also the future she carried with her, the milestones she would never reach, the laughter that would never return to their home. They worked tirelessly to keep her memory alive, speaking publicly, demanding justice, and pressing for answers. But as the years stretched on, their grief was compounded by the silence of an unsolved crime. Thunder Bay itself was shaken deeply. In a city where violent crime was rare, Tammy's murder became a defining moment. People who had once felt secure in their neighborhoods now looked over their shoulders. Children who once played freely in the streets were suddenly guarded. The trust that had once bound the community together fractured under the weight of fear. Cold case investigators revisited Tammy's murder repeatedly, holding on to the evidence collected in 1995, with the hope that advancements in forensic science might one day reveal her killer. DNA technology has since advanced far beyond what was possible at the time, and investigators continued to test and retest evidence, looking for the match that might finally provide answers. Yet to this day, no one has been charged. The haunting nature of Tammy's story lies in its suddenness. One moment she was a teenager walking through her neighborhood. The next, she was gone. Her murder was not just the loss of a young life, but a fracture in the sense of community safety. Every parent who remembers that summer still feels the weight of it. Every child who grew up in Thunder Bay during those years carries the memory of warnings, curfews, and fear. Her name remains on the list of Ontario's cold cases, her face still appearing in occasional media coverage, her story still whispered by those who remember. For her family, the waiting continues. They live with the unbearable knowledge that someone out there knows the truth, that somewhere, perhaps even within their own community, lies the secret of who killed Tammy Leakey. And so her story endures, not just as a tragedy, but as a reminder of how quickly innocence can be stolen, how deeply one crime can scar a city, and how, decades later, silence can be just as cruel as the crime itself. In the spring of 1983, the city of Ottawa pulsed with the energy of Canada's capital. Government workers filled office towers, families walked the busy streets of Centretown, and the Ottawa River gleamed under the thawing ice. Yet beneath that ordinary bustle, a case emerged that would come to symbolize the cruel nature of unsolved crime in the city. the disappearance of 27-year-old Louise Ellis. Louise was not a child, not a runaway, not someone who could be easily dismissed. She was a bright, independent woman with a creative streak, working as a freelance writer and illustrator. Friends described her as vibrant, with a warmth that drew people in. She had a network of acquaintances in Ottawa, people who knew her as reliable, passionate, and engaged. Which is why, when she suddenly vanished, alarm spread quickly. On a spring evening, Louise was last seen leaving her home. She told friends she had plans, but she never returned. When she failed to show up for scheduled meetings and stopped answering her phone, concern quickly escalated to panic. Days passed without word, and her absence grew more ominous with each hour. Police were contacted and a missing persons investigation began. Detectives dug into her life, piecing together her final known movements. They canvassed her neighborhood, spoke with friends, and traced her connections. Soon, suspicion began to circle around her personal relationships. Louise had recently ended a turbulent relationship, one that friends quietly admitted had left them uneasy. But in 1983, investigators lacked many of the forensic tools that would later become standard. Without concrete evidence, the case faltered. Weeks turned into months, and hope began to fade. Posters with Louise's face, once fresh and urgent, began to peel on bulletin boards. Rumors spread through Ottawa, each one darker than the last. Had she been abducted? Had she been murdered? Or had she, in some impossible twist, simply walked away? The truth would come years later, though not in the way her loved ones had hoped. It wasn't until 1995, more than a decade after her disappearance, that Louise's remains were discovered in a wooded area outside Ottawa. Forensic analysis confirmed what many had long feared. She had been murdered. The revelation was devastating. For her family and friends, the discovery of her body brought closure to the question of what had happened, but not to the torment of why, or who had done it. The investigation shifted into overdrive. Detectives scoured her old case files, re-examined interviews, and followed every lead with renewed intensity. But again, the evidence fell short. Witnesses' memories had faded, potential suspects had moved on with their lives, and the trail had grown cold. Even with advances in DNA testing, the case has remained stubbornly unsolved. Investigators have stated publicly that they believe Louise likely knew her killer, that this was not a random act of violence but something rooted in the complexities of her personal life. Yet no charges have ever been laid. For Ottawa, the case became a chilling reminder that even in a capital city, with its institutions of order and justice, people could vanish, and killers could remain unpunished. Louise's friends recall the way her laughter could fill a room, the way she sketched for hours with quiet focus, the way she dreamed of publishing her work. All of that was taken in a moment of violence, left to rot in the woods while the world moved on. The years since have only deepened the sense of injustice. Unsolved crimes are not just mysteries, they are open wounds. For Louise's loved ones, every anniversary of her disappearance is a reminder of the unanswered questions that loom over their lives. For Ottawa, her case is one of the city's most haunting cold files, a story whispered among true crime circles, a name that resurfaces every few years when the police appeal for new tips. What makes Louise's case especially haunting is the silence that surrounds it. No confession, no conclusive evidence, no resolution. Somewhere out there, perhaps even still walking the streets of Ottawa, is someone who knows exactly what happened that spring night in 1983. Someone who took her life and has carried that secret for decades. And that perhaps is the most terrifying detail of all. The idea that killers can live among us, their crimes buried not by the earth but by the passage of time. Louise Ellis's story is not just a tragedy. It's a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come, and the silence of the unknown is what haunts us most. In July of 1969, Montreal was alive with the kind of restless energy that defined the era. The city was vibrant, cultural, and diverse, basking in its status as one of Canada's great urban centers. But in the quiet suburb of Pointe-Claire, a nightmare began that has never truly ended, the disappearance of 14-year-old Sharon Pryor. Sharon was described as kind-hearted, outgoing, and full of promise. That summer, she was like many teenagers, navigating the world between childhood and independence. On the evening of March 29th, she planned to meet friends at a nearby pizzeria, just a short walk from her family's home. It was the kind of outing she had done countless times before, in a neighborhood where parents still believed their children were safe to roam. Sharon left her home just before 7 p.m., her hair brushed neatly, her outfit carefully chosen. She promised her mother she wouldn't be long, but she never made it to the restaurant. When she failed to arrive, her friends assumed she was running late. Hours later, when she hadn't come home, panic set in. Her family reported her missing almost immediately, and within days, the search for Sharon dominated the community. Police officers, volunteers, and neighbors scoured the streets, fields, and wooded areas of Pointe Claire. Flyers were posted in shop windows, her smiling face staring out with urgency. Just 4 days later, on April 1st, the search ended in horror. Sharon's body was discovered in a field not far from her home. She had been assaulted and murdered. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through Montreal. It wasn't just the loss of a young life. It was the shattering of a community's belief in its own safety. Parents who had once allowed their children to walk freely now clung to them tightly. The city itself seemed to dim under the weight of the tragedy. The investigation began immediately. Police collected evidence from the scene, including physical traces that would later prove crucial. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, tracked down leads, and followed up on any suspicious activity reported in the neighborhood. Despite their efforts, the case quickly grew complicated. Multiple suspects were considered, but none could be definitively tied to the crime. For decades, the case haunted detectives. The file remained open, and every few years, new investigators would take another look, hoping that fresh eyes or new technology might provide answers. Sharon's family lived with the gnawing torment of not knowing, of carrying the image of her final moments without understanding who had taken her away. As forensic science advanced, the evidence collected in 1969 was tested and retested. In the 2000s, DNA analysis offered new hope. Investigators were able to develop a genetic profile from the crime scene, but at the time, no match was found in criminal databases. Still, they held on to that fragment of hope, that one day science would catch up with the cruelty of the past. For years, Sharon's case was one of Montreal's most infamous unsolved murders, a name that echoed in true crime circles across Canada. Her story was retold on anniversaries, in newspaper retrospectives, and on cold case television programs. Each time, the public was reminded of a young girl who never came home, and of a killer who had walked free. Then, in 2023, more than 5 decades after her death, there was finally a breakthrough. Investigators revealed that advances in genetic genealogy had identified a suspect, a man named Franklin Roman, an American who had lived near Montreal in the late 1960s. He had died years earlier, but his DNA matched the profile from the crime scene. The revelation brought both relief and sorrow. On one hand, the mystery of who killed Sharon had finally been solved. On the other, there would be no trial, no chance for the family to face her killer in court, no opportunity for justice to be served in the traditional sense. For her family, it was an answer they had waited more than 50 years to hear, but it was also a reminder of the decades they had spent in anguish. Sharon's story remains one of the most haunting cold cases in Canadian history, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the long shadow it cast over her family and community. For more than half a century, her name was spoken with sorrow, her case a symbol of stolen innocence. Even with the answer now in hand, the ache of her loss remains, a reminder of how one night's walk to a pizzeria became a tragedy that defined a generation. In the summer of 1969, the city of Montreal was alive with music, culture, and the restless energy of a generation caught between tradition and change. It was the kind of place where the air felt heavy with possibility. But for the family of a young boy named Charles Horvath-Allan, Montreal would come to symbolize something much darker, an endless nightmare without answers. Charles was just 20 years old in 1989 when he traveled from his home in the United Kingdom to Canada. He had been raised partly in Canada, his family having lived there when he was younger, and now, as a young man, he returned to experience it for himself. He wanted adventure, to see more of the world, to carve out a path of independence before committing to a career. He told his mother he would spend some time in British Columbia, working odd jobs, camping, and meeting people. Charles had a free spirit, and he carried with him the easy charisma that made him quick to befriend strangers. In May of that year, he arrived in Kelowna, a lakeside city in British Columbia, known for its beauty and its tight-knit community. He planned to stay at a local campground, living cheaply while he figured out his next move. He wrote to his mother, Denise, telling her of his plans and assuring her that he was safe. But by late May, his letters stopped, and after May 26, 1989, no one saw Charles again. His disappearance was not immediately treated with alarm. Charles was young, adventurous, and transient. It was easy to assume he had simply moved on, maybe traveling further into Canada or even across the border into the United States. But when weeks passed with no word, his mother grew worried. She knew her son. He would never let so much time go by without contact. By June, Denise flew to Canada to search for her son herself. Her arrival marked the beginning of a decades-long quest for answers. She retraced his steps, visiting the campground where he had last been seen, speaking with fellow travelers and locals, trying to piece together his final days. What she found was troubling. Witnesses said Charles had been at the tiny tent town campsite, a place known for young travelers and seasonal workers. He had been social, meeting people, talking freely. But then suddenly he was gone. His belongings, including clothes, sleeping bag, and personal items, were left behind. The only thing missing was him. Police were reluctant at first. They suggested Charles might have wandered off or chosen to disappear. After all, he was an adult. But Denise refused to accept that. She knew something terrible had happened. Her son would not abandon his family, would not vanish without a word. As she pressed harder, she uncovered rumors that haunted her. Some suggested Charles had been caught up in a violent altercation at the campsite. Others whispered he may have been killed and his body disposed of in Okanagan Lake, but no evidence ever surfaced. The years that followed became a relentless cycle of hope and heartbreak for Denise. Every tip, every possible lead she pursued with unwavering determination. She traveled across Canada, appeared on television programs, spoke to reporters, anything to keep Charles's case alive. She believed someone out there knew the truth, and she would not rest until she found it. But as time stretched on, the silence grew heavier. Police conducted searches of the lake, interviews with known associates, and reviews of the few belongings Charles had left behind. Nothing revealed what had happened. Theories swirled endlessly. Was Charles the victim of foul play? Did he stumble into an accident in the rugged terrain surrounding Kelowna? Or was there a darker story, one involving people at the campsite who didn't want the truth revealed? What made Charles's case so haunting was the cruel limbo it left his family in. His mother described it as living in two worlds at once. One where her son was alive, out there somewhere, and one where he had been taken from her in violence. Every phone call, every knock at the door carried the weight of possibility. Decades later, the case remains open. Denise continued her search until her death in 2017. Never finding the answers she so desperately sought. To this day, Charles's fate is unknown. His face is frozen in time, forever a young man of 20 smiling in photographs, his life cut short in ways no one can fully explain. For Kelowna, the case has lingered as one of its most enduring mysteries. Residents still remember the boy who vanished from their campground, the mother who crossed oceans to find him, and the chilling silence that has surrounded the case ever since. For Canada, Charles's disappearance stands as a reminder of how easily a person can slip into the void, how quickly hope can turn into grief. The haunting question of Charles Horvath-Allan's story is not just what happened to him, but why no one has ever come forward with the truth. In a campground full of people, in a city that buzzed with activity, a young man vanished without a trace. Someone somewhere must know the answer. But for more than 3 decades, that answer has remained buried in shadows. The most terrifying part is not just that Charles disappeared, but that he could have been any young traveler, carefree, hopeful, trusting. His story resonates because it reflects the vulnerability of youth, the danger that lurks even in places that seem safe, and the unbearable ache of a mother who died without knowing her son's fate. And so his name remains on the list of Canada's missing, a ghostly reminder that sometimes the truth is not simply lost, it is deliberately hidden. Until the day someone steps forward, or evidence surfaces from the depths of Okanagan Lake, Charles's story will remain one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries. On a warm August night in 1992, the quiet streets of Guelph, Ontario, carried the hum of cicadas and the soft glow of street lamps. It was the kind of small city where neighbors knew each other's names, where crime felt like something that happened elsewhere. But in the early hours of August 6th, that sense of safety was torn apart when 23-year-old Elizabeth Bain vanished, leaving behind one of Ontario's most haunting mysteries. Elizabeth, known as Liz to friends, was a university student, bright, ambitious, and deeply loved by her family. She had a warm, approachable nature and a determination that promised a bright future. On that August evening, she told her family she was heading out to check the schedule at the local tennis courts. She left in her silver Honda Civic, casually, as though she would be back within the hour. She never returned. When Liz's family realized she hadn't come home, they began calling her friends. Nobody had seen her. The following morning, when her car was discovered abandoned near Lake Ontario, the situation shifted from worry to horror. The interior of the vehicle told a story no one wanted to believe. Bloodstains were found inside, later confirmed to be Elizabeth's. The investigation began immediately. Police interviewed friends, classmates, and neighbors, trying to piece together who might want to harm a young woman with no known enemies. Very quickly, suspicion fell on her boyfriend, Robert Baltovich. He was cooperative at first, but inconsistencies in his statements caught the attention of detectives. They began building a case around him, suggesting jealousy and obsession as possible motives. In 1992, forensic science was not what it is today. The evidence against Robert was circumstantial, statements, timelines, assumptions about behavior. But in 1995, he was arrested and charged with Elizabeth's murder, despite the fact that her body had never been found. In 1992, Canada was still deeply influenced by cases where convictions relied on narrative as much as hard science, and prosecutors argued that Robert had killed Elizabeth in a fit of rage. The trial captured national attention. It was gripping not only because of the crime, but because of the absence of a body. Elizabeth's family sat through the proceedings with quiet agony, desperate for answers, desperate to know what had happened to their daughter. In 1992, after a lengthy trial, Robert was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. Over the next decade, doubts about the conviction began to mount. Advocates argued that Robert's trial had been riddled with problems, weak evidence, questionable assumptions, and an over-reliance on circumstantial detail. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate about another possible suspect, Paul Bernardo, the notorious Scarborough rapist and later convicted killer. Bernardo had been active in the area at the time of Elizabeth's disappearance, and some of his known methods bore similarities to what might have happened to her. By 2000, the case against Robert began to unravel. His legal team fought tirelessly, pointing out the lack of forensic evidence linking him to the crime. In 2004, his conviction was overturned on appeal. By 2008, prosecutors announced they would not seek a retrial. Robert was officially acquitted, having spent nearly a decade in prison for a crime that had never been definitively linked to him. For Elizabeth's family, the ordeal was doubly cruel. Not only had they lost their daughter, but the justice system had consumed years of its energy pursuing the wrong man. To this day, Elizabeth Bain's body has never been found, and no one has been conclusively identified as her killer. The case remains a cold file, still whispered about in Canadian true crime circles. Theories abound. Some believe Bernardo was responsible. Others maintain that someone close to Elizabeth must have been involved. But without a body, without definitive evidence, the truth remains locked in silence. The haunting legacy of Elizabeth Bain's disappearance is not just in the loss of a young woman with a bright future, but in the failures of a justice system that chased shadows instead of certainty. Her family continues to live with unanswered questions. Where is she? Who was responsible? And why, after all these years, has the truth remained hidden? Elizabeth's story endures as one of Canada's most painful unsolved crimes, a reminder that sometimes justice falters, and the people left behind must carry not only their grief, but the heavy burden of doubt. On the evening of October 13, 1984, in the small town of Arnprior, Ontario, a 9-year-old girl named Christine Jessup vanished from her neighborhood. Christine was a bright, cheerful child with a love for animals and a contagious smile that lit up every room she entered. That autumn day had been ordinary, filled with the routines of family life, until it was shattered by her disappearance. Christine's parents returned home to find the house quiet, her belongings untouched, but their daughter nowhere to be found. Panic set in immediately. Friends and neighbors joined the search, combing the streets, parks, and fields. Police were called, and the case escalated quickly. This wasn't a child who had wandered off. Something was terribly wrong. For weeks the community searched, holding on to the hope that Christine would come home. Flyers with her photograph were posted on telephone poles, her innocent face becoming a symbol of a town gripped by fear. But the truth revealed itself 2 months later in December. Christine's body was discovered in a rural area, miles away from her home. She had been assaulted and murdered. The shock that followed rippled through Ontario. Christine's case became a national story, dominating headlines and nightly news. Parents who had once felt secure in letting their children play outside now held them close. Communities across the province were united in horror and grief. The investigation zeroed in on a neighbor, a young man named Guy Paul Morin. He was quiet, reserved, and, in the eyes of investigators, an easy target for suspicion. Police and prosecutors began to build a case against him, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and questionable forensic practices. In 1986, Morin was arrested, charged, and later convicted of Christine's murder. For Christine's grieving family, the conviction felt like a step toward closure. The community believed justice had been served. But beneath the surface, cracks in the case were already forming. The forensic evidence used at trial was flawed, and the investigative methods had been deeply compromised by tunnel vision. Years later, with the advent of improved DNA testing, those cracks split wide open. In 1995, DNA analysis conclusively proved that Morin was innocent. After nearly a decade of being branded a child killer, he was fully exonerated. The Canadian justice system issued a formal apology, acknowledging one of the most grievous wrongful convictions in the country's history. But while Morin's name was cleared, Christine's true killer remained unidentified. The evidence collected from the crime scene was revisited repeatedly, tested against growing databases, but no match was ever found. Her family endured the unbearable reality that justice for their daughter had slipped further away, even as the system attempted to correct its mistakes. The tragedy of Christine Jessup's case lies in its double weight: the loss of a child to unimaginable violence, and the wrongful destruction of another person's life in the desperate rush for justice. The true killer walked free, while Morin bore the stigma of guilt for nearly 10 years. For decades, Christine's case haunted Ontario as one of its most infamous unsolved murders. Investigators held onto the DNA profile, waiting for science or a database match to break the silence. In 2020, after 36 years, the breakthrough finally came. Advances in genetic genealogy identified a new suspect: Calvin Hoover, a man who had lived near Christine's family at the time of her murder. Hoover, however, had died by suicide in 2015. The answer had come too late for a trial, too late for Christine's parents to confront the man responsible. The identification of Hoover brought bittersweet closure. Christine's family finally knew who had taken her life, but the decades of suffering, the wrongful conviction, and the long silence could never be erased. The scars of her case remain, etched into Canadian legal history, as both a story of horror and of justice delayed. Christine Jessup's name endures as a chilling reminder that the pursuit of truth can falter, that innocence can be stolen twice, once by violence and again by a system too eager for resolution. Her story is one Canada will never forget. In the fall of 1990, the city of St. John, New Brunswick, was rattled by a crime so brutal it still lingers in the collective memory of the Maritimes, the murder of 45-year-old businesswoman and mother, Debbie Cooper. Debbie was well known in her community. She worked hard, raised her children with love, and was described by friends as dependable, strong-willed, and fiercely protective of her family. Her disappearance in September that year would mark the beginning of one of the region's most haunting unsolved mysteries. On September 18th, Debbie was last seen leaving her workplace in the late afternoon. She had plans that evening but never arrived. When she failed to return home, alarm bells went off quickly. Debbie was not the type to vanish without explanation. The next morning, her car was discovered abandoned in a parking lot near a local shopping center. Inside were her personal belongings, purse, identification, and keys. It was clear she hadn't simply walked away. 2 days later, the search for Debbie ended in horror. Her body was found in a wooded area outside the city. She had been brutally murdered, the crime marked by a level of violence that stunned even veteran investigators. Police immediately launched a large-scale investigation, combing through her personal life, professional connections, and daily routines for any sign of motive or suspect. The investigation took detectives into complicated territory. Debbie was a respected businesswoman who had crossed paths with many people in St. John's close-knit community. Police interviewed dozens of potential witnesses and considered multiple theories. Was this a crime of opportunity, or had someone targeted her specifically? Despite the exhaustive efforts, the case quickly hit dead ends. Rumors swirled in the city. Some believed she had been stalked. Others whispered about personal disputes that may have turned deadly. But nothing concrete ever surfaced. Without forensic breakthroughs or a clear suspect, the investigation began to stall. For Debbie's children, the loss was life-shattering. They had not only lost their mother, but had also been left with a void filled by unanswered questions. Friends remember the way the family withdrew in those years, navigating both their grief and the shadow of an unsolved crime. As years passed, St. John continued to grapple with the memory of Debbie's murder. The brutality of the case set it apart, a reminder that even in a relatively small city, darkness could strike without warning. It became one of the province's most notorious cold cases, drawing periodic media attention and appeals for new information. Advances in forensic science offered new avenues for hope. Evidence collected from the crime scene was preserved, with investigators revisiting it periodically as DNA technology advanced. Yet, to this day, no definitive match has been found. What makes Debbie Cooper's story especially haunting is the feeling of proximity. The sense that her killer may have been someone she knew, someone still living in the community, carrying their secret for decades. The fact that her belongings were left behind, that her life was ended with such violence, suggests a crime driven by rage or a deeply personal motive. And yet, no one has ever been held accountable. For the people of St. John, her name is more than a cold case file. It is a memory etched into the city's identity. For her family, it is a wound that never closed, despite the passing years. They continue to live with the ache of not knowing, the hollow absence of justice, and the cruel silence of time. Debbie's story is a reminder that unsolved crimes are not just mysteries. They are legacies of pain. They linger in the lives of those left behind and in the streets where they happened. And in St. John, New Brunswick, the murder of Debbie Cooper remains a shadow, a chilling echo of violence with no resolution. In the summer of 2002, the city of Toronto was alive with its usual mix of noise and movement. Streetcars rattling through intersections, office towers glowing into the night, and neighborhoods buzzing with the rhythms of Canada's largest city. But in late July, A mystery unfolded that would become one of Toronto's most infamous unsolved cases: the disappearance and murder of 23-year-old Evelyn Lau. Evelyn was known among her friends as ambitious, thoughtful, and full of energy. She worked part-time while finishing school, dreaming of building a future that stretched far beyond the city blocks she walked each day. On the evening of July 29th, she was last seen leaving her apartment, telling friends she was heading out for a short errand. It was nothing unusual, nothing that suggested danger, but when she didn't return home that night, alarm quickly set in. Her family reported her missing the next morning. Police responded swiftly, aware that Evelyn's disappearance was out of character. Flyers with her photograph were distributed across downtown Toronto, her face appearing on lampposts and storefront windows. The search grew more urgent with each passing day. 3 days later, the grim truth came to light. Evelyn's body was discovered in a wooded area on the outskirts of the city. She had been murdered, the crime carried out with a coldness that stunned investigators. The discovery shifted the case from a missing person to a homicide investigation, and the city was suddenly gripped by fear. Detectives worked tirelessly, canvassing her neighborhood, retracing her final steps, and interviewing anyone who might have seen her on the night she disappeared. The investigation turned up scattered pieces of information. A witness claimed to have seen her speaking with an unknown man. Others recalled a vehicle parked near her apartment, but nothing definitive emerged. Despite the urgency, the case stalled quickly. No weapon was recovered. No clear suspect was identified. The crime scene offered only fragments of evidence that, at the time, could not be pieced together. Toronto police appealed repeatedly to the public, holding press conferences and asking for tips, but the silence deepened. As months passed, Evelyn's murder slipped from daily headlines but never left the minds of her family. They lived with the unbearable weight of not only losing her but of knowing her killer had walked away without consequence. Friends remembered her as someone who loved deeply, who laughed loudly, who dreamed boldly, memories now frozen in time. Over the years, investigators revisited her case, holding on to the evidence with the hope that advancements in DNA technology might one day bring answers. But as of today, no arrest has been made. Her file remains open, a cold case that continues to haunt Toronto's police and the community that once searched desperately for her. What makes Evelyn's case especially haunting is its ordinariness. She wasn't walking into danger knowingly. She was running an errand, stepping out into the city she called home. The randomness of her death, the lack of resolution, leaves behind a chilling truth. Sometimes violence erupts without warning, and justice never arrives. For her family, 2 decades have passed without closure. They live with the silence of unanswered questions, the ache of an empty chair, and the knowledge that Evelyn's dreams ended in the woods that summer. For Toronto, her name is another on the long list of cold cases, a reminder that beneath the bright lights of the city lies a darker reality. Evelyn Lau's story closes not with resolution but with absence. Absence of justice, absence of truth, absence of the future she deserved. And in that silence, her case continues to haunt, a chilling reminder that some crimes refuse to fade with time. These stories remind us that justice delayed can feel like justice denied, but the memories of the victims must never fade. For more real-life crime documentaries, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next deep dive into the crimes that still haunt.